Good afternoon. You know, for such an event, it always takes a lot of work behind the scene. So the first thing I do is I would like to ask you to give a round of applause for all the volunteers who did the work. And I met Urvashi in April 2016. Yeah, time passes. We were in the same forum, and I was so moved and impressed by her. I almost decided right away that I want to see her in Taiwan because we do need to listen to her. We do need to know more, to learn more about India. I'm a volunteer of the foundation, which started 13 years ago. And my job, my assigned job, is to do the housekeeping report. So first of all, in your hand, you have this orange color brochure. Because this is 2018, we are doing the 50th anniversary retrospective of 1968. So the upcoming event, don't forget April 15 and April 28, but both of these are in Mandarin. So for April 15th is a talk on the May movement of 1968, France, Paris. That's an exciting time where the student movement combined with labor movement and everything else together, which had a huge impact on the development later in France. And April 28th, we have a writer flying into Taiwan from Osaka to talk about 1968 Japan. We actually know very little about that part of history. And then for people who are under 30, can you raise your hand if you are under 30? Wow, well, I think it's 90%. So here's your chance. You probably have heard of the Economic Forum of Davos in Switzerland. But there is another one, which is very important, which started in 1945. That's the European Forum Alpbach in Austria, which is a beautiful village in the depths of the Alps. And the foundation is the Asian partner for European Forum Alpbach. And we sponsor 5 people who are under the age of 30 to go to Austria in August. And you'll be there for 3 weeks, talking with world leaders from different areas, and you will be sharing your ideas with another 699 students from different regions of the world, meaning they take altogether 700 students. So do grab this opportunity. All the information is online. So for housekeeping, and we have very many distinguished guests here as well. But allow me to only mention 2 friends here. One is the ambassador of Belize to the Republic of China. That's Miss Haylock. Where are you sitting? Great. Good to have you. And another is the representative of Papua New Guinea Trade Office in Taiwan, Mr. Kunji. Okay. Good to have you. Okay, I'd really like to tell you a lot about Urvashi today, but it's not my job today. We have a wonderful moderator today. That's the Professor Zhong Shifang from Zhengzhi University. And I'm going to read a little bit from what we have prepared about the moderator today. In 1993, Shifang founded Trees Music and Art. That is an independent folk and grassroots music record label, which has nurtured some of the most vital Taiwanese music artists for 3 decades. And in 2001, Shifang started the Migration Music Festival, which is a major platform in Taiwan for folk and world music that embraces artistic expression with activism. So that is not just a music festival. It is a music festival as a platform for social progress. And as a filmmaker, that is something really extra. As a filmmaker, Professor Chong gained acclaim for her first documentary, which is called From Border to Border, which traces the history of Chinese immigrants in India. Okay, so we have one extraordinary woman who hosts the talk of a very extraordinary woman from India today. What a pleasure. Let's welcome Shifang.
Thank you, Professor Leung, for the nice introduction. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today. I'm going to read a passage from her book. I realized then that in this silence lay the many hidden histories of partition, the histories that have always hovered at the edges of those that have been told, the histories that describe the dark side of freedom. As I began to search, slowly, inexorably, this history revealed itself. There was from the book, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, written by our speaker today, Urvashi Butalia. The book is commented by the prominent Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, one of the most important books ever to be written about the partition of the Indian subcontinent. Urvashi Butalia was born into a progressive and atheist family of Punjabi heritage. Her mother, Sabhadra Butalia, a refugee of the 1947 partition, was a feminist who ran the counseling center for women. Urvashi Butalia started her career working with the Oxford University Press in Delhi. Over decades, she has devoted herself to the entrepreneurship of founding and managing independent publishing houses. She co-founded India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, in 1984, and is currently directing the Zuban books, an imprint of Kali for Women and among the most important of feminist voices in India. Urvashi Butalia has a long involvement in the women's movement in India. She writes and publishes essays and articles on a wide range of issues on women and gender with the feminist and the left-wing perspectives. Her talk today will draw on the hidden history of partition and the political activism within women's movement in India, and the representations of Indian women in mass media. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give us our warmest welcome to our speaker today, Urvashi Butalia.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. It's very strange to hear yourself described by someone else because you keep thinking I'm just a regular girl, and you wonder at all of that. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to apologize to you if many of you were expecting to see the young woman with typewriters that you saw on the poster. It's a great poster, but that is me 30 years ago. The same feminist, but grown now into the feminist you saw on the screen. I'm delighted and honored to be invited to speak here, and I'd like to thank the Lung Yung Tai Foundation, Cultural Foundation, for thinking of me. As Dr. Lung mentioned to you, we met a couple of years ago in Boston. And likewise, I was really impressed with her and listening to her story. and thought how amazing it was to make those kinds of friendships across borders, and really pleased to be invited here to speak. And before I start, I want also to thank the under 30s who have come and sat on the floor here. I think it's great that you've done that. Many, many thanks. You know, when we met in Boston, in conversations, I began to feel that despite our very, very different histories, there were a number of commonalities between Taiwan and India. And this might sound strange because we are two completely different countries, not only in size and scale, but in all sorts of other things. But I did think that there were some commonalities and a great deal that we could learn from each other. And as I hope to show in this talk, the commonalities will become clear in what I'm talking about. I want to start by telling you some stories. I find that usually stories help to connect people in ways that academic arguments don't. So here is my first story. A few months ago, I was at an event organized by a child rights organization in Delhi. And sitting next to me in the audience was a thin, frail woman dressed very differently from me. And it was clear to me from her clothes that she belonged to a village in North India. Her name is Bhavari Devi. I know her. I have known her for many years. She belongs to the very bottom of the economic and caste ladder in India. She's poor. Her husband is a potter, and their livelihood consists of making terracotta pots, which people use in villages and in towns to store water. So they work with the raw material of mud and clay, which they pick up from around them, and then they fashion that using a potter's wheel into handmade pots, and we buy them, use them to store water, and so on. But Bhavari has another history. In the early 90s, she was working with a large development organization, a development project set up by the Indian government in her home state of Rajasthan, which is in North India. One of her tasks was to make people aware of the law that made child marriages illegal in India. This meant trying to persuade parents to let their children study instead of arranging their marriages. In one such attempt, she came across a group of upper caste men who were preparing to marry their young children. When she tried to stop them, the men, furious that a woman of a lower class than them could dare to tell them what to do, they decided to teach her a lesson. And while she was out in the fields working, 4 of them raped her. Bhavari's experience led to huge protests by women's groups in Rajasthan and across the country. It also resulted in widespread discussions within the women's movement. The protests focused on the continuing sexual violence towards women and the urgent need to address it. The discussions focused on another aspect. Bhavari was performing her job when she was raped. Thus, theoretically, even though she was out in the fields, she was at work. Was she therefore not entitled to some sort of guarantee of a safe and secure workplace? Opposition to Bhavari, for there is always some opposition to the woman who has faced sexual violence. Opposition to her demanded to know what she was doing out of the village so late at night. What was she doing in the fields? And yet, these were the very areas where she carried out her work. So if families were out in the fields, it was her job to go and talk to them and persuade them not to marry their children. So women's groups began to ask the question, how should the workplace be defined for women? Could a field be seen as a workplace? Or was it only the 4 walls of an office that signified a workplace? And if indeed the field could be seen as a workspace, then surely the worker, in this case Bhavari, had a right to a secure and safe working environment. The discussions led to the filing of what was to become a historic petition in the Supreme Court of India. It was called the Vishakha Petition. It demanded that measures be put in place to ensure safety and security for women in the workplace. The Supreme Court of India issued an initial set of guidelines to offices and institutions, and eventually they issued a law on sexual harassment in the workplace, one that today mandates that all offices, all institutions, all factories that employ more than 20 people must institute measures to prevent and contain sexual harassment and to deal with such cases as do occur. These measures involve setting up committees to deal with them, holding workshops with their staff, sensitizing workers, sensitizing managers, and putting in place a set of rules that can apply when a case is filed. The morning before I met Bhavri, I had been at a large corporate gathering where gender discrimination at the workplace was a key item on the agenda. A large hall filled with hundreds of women and some men discussed and debated the importance of dealing with this issue, which is now being done across the board in many, many corporate institutions in India. Sexual harassment was a key item on the agenda, and CEO after CEO came up onto the stage to speak of the necessity of dealing with this long-silenced problem. Nobody really remembered that the problem had been given a voice, a name, and a materiality by a poor village woman from Rajasthan, the woman called Bhavri Devi. Bhavri's story is not an unfamiliar one in India, and in many ways it encapsulates the different poles of women's lives in the country. Hundreds of millions of women live like Bhavri in poverty with violence and prejudice all around them. But every woman carries in her heart a fierce desire to change the realities of her life. This isn't always easy. Sometimes it's impossible. But every battle that is fought, every small victory that's gained, testifies to women's extraordinary courage and resilience. I want here to tell you my second story. It's the story of a young woman from Bengal, and she is called Baby Haldar. She was born into a poor family and lived an extremely difficult life. Her mother, fed up of her father's alcoholism, ran away while Baby, that's her nickname, and she never actually got a proper name, while Baby was still a child. And the task of running the home came on her shoulders and those of her sister, barely 2 years older than her. When she turned 12, Baby was married to a man more than twice her age. He turned out to be jobless, violent, and an alcoholic. By the age of 13, she was a mother. She had 2 more children and lived a life of utter poverty and desperation. One day, deciding that she could take it no more, she picked up her 3 children. She got onto a train to Delhi without a ticket and sat down outside the toilet of the train and came to Delhi. In Delhi, she had no contact. She knew she had a brother over there somewhere and that he was a car mechanic. Somehow she managed to find him. He was not very happy to see her because he himself was poor, and to feed 4 more people was difficult for him. But the family is a very strong thing in India. He gave her shelter, and eventually, after much struggle, she found a job as a domestic worker in the house of a retired professor. The professor noticed her love of books because she spent a lot of time in his library. And he asked her if she wanted to read, and she told him how she was desperate to study but had been married and could not continue her studies. He then started to lend her books and encouraged her to read. He gave her time off to read. Soon, a year after this began, he gave her a notebook and suggested that she write her life. After some hesitation, thinking, what is my life? I am a poor woman. What is there to write? She decided to follow his advice, and she wrote her life. The book that she wrote became an instant bestseller. Today, Baby, who works as a trainer with sex workers in Kolkata, is an internationally published and acclaimed writer, and she is an inspiration to hundreds of thousands of women like her in India. I have a third story to tell you, and then I'll come to more stories right at the end. This is the story of a woman called Salma. Her real name is Rokaya. She comes from a small, very tightly knit Muslim community in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. In her village, traditionally, girls were pulled out of school once they began menstruating and kept at home until they were married. This happened to her too. From the time she became a teenager till she was nearly 20, she more or less remained incarcerated within the four walls of her home. But she too, like Baby, was desperate to study, to read, to write. During this time, her brother, who is a writer, smuggled in books for her to read, and her mother smuggled out things that she wrote. Salma, and had them published under the pseudonym Salma. Salma wrote poetry, erotic poetry, all concerned with the changes, the sexual changes she was seeing in her body, all concerned with desire which remained unfulfilled, all concerned with her growing awareness of sexuality. And her mother smuggled out these poems and had them published in journals, and they created a revolution in the very conservative world of Tamil literature dominated mostly by men. Nobody knew who this woman was. Nobody knew where she was, but here she was writing erotic poetry, and which was being read widely and talked about. At the age of 20, Salma was married to a man in a neighboring village. Her marriage was arranged. He was also the regular political candidate from that area who had held elected power for a long time at the village level. So we have governance bodies that go down from the parliament to the local level, and he was a village level politician. Shortly after Salma's marriage, sorry, I'm standing too close to it. Shortly after Salma's marriage, the Indian state brought in a legislation that was to change her life and the lives of millions of women like her. In 1992, the government introduced a law that said that there had to be compulsory reservation or quotas of 33% for women in elected posts at village and municipal levels. In the first election that followed that legislation in 1993-94, across India, 5 million women came out to contest elections. 1 in every 100 women living in rural India fought an election. 800,000 of them came to power. Today, this figure stands at 1.3 million. Salma was one of these women. In her family, the post that her husband had traditionally held became a reserved post for women. He could no longer stand for election. So the family decided to do what many families did, thinking that women know nothing about power, so let's just put them up and they will just be proxies and we can still continue to use power through them. So the face of power will be a woman, but the actual power will be in the hands of the man or the family. They asked every woman in the family except Salma if she would be willing to stand for the election. Unused to power, unused to being in the public space, everyone said no. They did not ask Salma, but she came forward and said, I'll do it. And so they had to have her stand for election. When she stood, the first thing that happened was the veil came off. So Salma was veiled. She's a Muslim woman, very traditional, but you cannot campaign without a face. And so the veil came off. And once the veil came off, there was no stopping Salma. And she won the election. She very soon moved to state-level politics. Today, she is out of power because the political party to which she belongs is out of power, but she's a hugely well-known name and speaks widely and is trying to get back into power. And as a politician, she wielded power with tremendous responsibility and care and was not corrupt, as men often are. Bhamvari, Baby, Salma, their stories are not just individual stories. They are among the thousands of such stories of women's courage and resilience that you'll find in India. Many of these women come from poverty and a lack of privilege. But there are others, some who belong to a different class, some who come from backgrounds of wealth and education, who have also made their way in life. These include bankers, so several of the most important banks in India are headed by women, industrialists, such as in shipping, in hospitality, in sugar, in medicine, in hotels, politicians, a woman prime minister and women chief ministers of some of the most important states in India, flight commanders. There are private airlines that have 50% of their pilots as women, artists, photographers, journalists, writers, and more. These women's stories also speak of a wider reality, and that has to do with policies and legislation. Bhamvari's experience eventually led to the enactment of a law on sexual harassment, one that today is empowering more and more women to speak out, even as women are fighting to change some of its problematic assumptions. Salma's experience was not the catalyst for a wider change, but she, an individual, was deeply impacted by legislation enacted by the state, which helped her to change her life as it did for many millions of women. How do these contradictory realities sit together? What is the real truth about Indian women? Is their story one of repression and discrimination, as is widely believed, or is it one of struggle and achievement? Is their story one of an indifferent patriarchal state, or a sensitive and supportive one? Is it a story of change, or are we looking at stagnation, or indeed at regression? As always with such questions, there are no easy answers. The story of Indian women, and that is my argument in this talk, and that's why I called my talk a truth tale. The story of Indian women is not simple or singular, nor can it be told in binaries of oppression and empowerment or change and stagnation. It is, like all stories, multiple, overlapping, paradoxical, and often contradictory. Statistics, for example, will tell you one story. Policy and planning documents will tell you another. Ground-level realities provide evidence of a different kind, and so it goes on. Perhaps the one thing that can be said with any certainty is that while patriarchies supported by religion, tradition, social and cultural sanctions have always had very strong roots in India, there has equally been a tradition of rebellion and protest, both individual and collective. Let me trace a little of the history of women in India to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. If we look into the history of Indian literature, from as far back as the 6th century BCE, we find evidence of women's writings that details their stories and struggles. One of my favorite stories is from a much later period, from the 19th century, when a 14-year-old low-caste girl called Muktabai wrote a sort of open letter to the upper castes and upper classes, challenging their monopoly of knowledge and the denial of education to her community. And she said to them, "Who the hell are you to deny us what we rightfully have and what we should have?" Years later, women fought fierce battles for independence from British colonial rule. Gandhi's campaigns, for example, were filled with women activists who took over the campaigns despite Gandhi's initial reluctance to include them. As you may know, Gandhi had unique methods to protest against the British. One of these was called the Salt Campaign. The British had begun to impose a tax on salt in order to earn money from Indians. Gandhi decided to protest this by making salt illegally and distributing it. His argument was, who are the British who are ruling our country to make salt, which is an item of daily use, and to tax it? We must have salt without tax. We must have salt. We can make our own salt. Who are they to do this? It's a really unique method of struggle. Along with a large number of people, all men, he marched for many miles to the sea to make salt. It was called the Salt March. He refused to include women in his campaign, thinking that the journey would be too difficult for them. But the women had a different idea. They forced themselves. They ambushed the march. They pushed the men out. They said, what do you guys know about salt? We use it. We are the ones who use it every day in the kitchens. You get out. We'll do the walk. We'll make the salt. And we will sell it, and we will go to jail. And that's what they did. And the Salt March became completely a women's march. When independence came, women participated in every possible way in creating the new nation, and they were central to the creation of India's egalitarian constitution. And yet, as the histories of many nation states have shown, no matter that the battles that are fought for their creation may be egalitarian, once such states come into being, patriarchies are not so easily dislodged. One of the reasons for this is that in the handover or in the snatching of power, what the victors and the vanquished have in common is the strong belief in patriarchy. And while everything else may get dislodged, this remains very firmly in place. Women who may have been involved in independence movements once again find themselves at the receiving end of the patriarchal mindset, and often this means they retreat into the home because it becomes difficult to fight your own men, your own comrades, people you love. This has happened in India too. But there was another episode in our history that pushed women into difficult positions. As they prepared to depart from India, our colonial masters, the British, divided the country into two, India and Pakistan, on the basis of religion. The division or partition of the country led to widespread fear and uncertainty and terrible violence, as people no longer knew where they belonged or whom to trust. Friends suddenly became enemies, and religion, often a binding force, became its exact opposite. For several months, Hindus and Muslims killed each other in brutal ways, turning the birth of their two countries into bloodbaths. Over 1 million people died. Some 12 million migrated to new homes, and it is estimated that roughly 100,000 women were sexually assaulted, raped, forcibly married, and sold into prostitution. The partition experience was a great shock for Indian women because, in a sense, the violence women faced resulted in their retreating from public view. It took some years before women became once again visible in activism, and this began with protest movements all over the country as people became disillusioned with the unmet promises of independence. It was out of this sense of disillusionment that a new generation of feminists was born. That was my generation of feminists who came to feminism in the 70s and 80s. How much time do I have? Sorry, I want to see. Sorry? Okay, great. Yeah, I don't want to have to rush through the latter part. One of the earliest campaigns of the fledgling women's movement was against sexual violence. Triggered by the acquittal of 2 policemen in a case of rape of a minor girl, this campaign spread across the country and eventually led to the first changes in the law on rape in 1983. Subsequently, violence became a key issue in the movement, and it has stayed so to this day. Over time, the movement took up other campaigns: women's health, poverty, their rights in marriage, inheritance, the family, sexuality, caste, queer and trans identities, and more. In recent years, the threat posed to women's rights by fundamentalist right-wing parties has also been a major challenge. The movement has grown and diversified. It has also become quite divided, with internal questions and discussions. But overall, despite contentious issues, our understanding of issues has grown and developed, and our discussions and conversations have never stopped. I don't have the time to go into a detailed history of the women's movement in India, so I will only say here that the movement is complex and diverse and very, very strong. Let me now return to the question with which we began. What are we talking about when we speak of Indian women? We see a country with a strong involvement of women in the independence movement, and then for some decades, their disappearance from public view. In this, India is no different from many countries in the world. We see a country that created, like many countries that came into being that time as democracies, a strong and very egalitarian constitution, and in later years, some good laws, which over time changed and became better and became more egalitarian. And here, I think we are quite similar to you, because over time, your laws have also changed and become more egalitarian. We see a women's movement that is dynamic and strong, that questioned the state, that fought for change, and that was successful in both demanding and gaining some changes. But we also see large numbers of women who are oppressed, discriminated against, and we see many world-recognized indicators which lead us to think that the situation of women must be really terrible. Just yesterday, I was talking to a young journalist who said to me that she thought India was a terribly dangerous country for women. And many other conversations that I've had in the last day or so have brought this point home to me, how people perceive India to be not a country for women. And also we see a country that is filled with stories of change that women are making on the ground, the ways in which they are fighting to fulfill their dreams, and we see their courage and we see their resilience. What then is the truth of Indian women? I want to suggest that there is not one single truth, that all of these realities make up the reality of the lives of Indian women. Why then, we must ask ourselves, does the perception exist that ours is one of the worst countries for women in the world and that we live lives of terrible suffering? There is no doubt that on some indicators we do not fare well at all. Our workforce participation rates are falling. We are not doing well in removing poverty. Okay, women need to make huge improvements in literacy. Comparisons with Taiwan, where you have addressed many of these things, will show how important it is to make this change. But there are other statistics that tell a different story. I spoke earlier of the law that brought in quotas or reservations for women in elected posts at village level. As a result of this law, today we have 1.3 million women in positions of elected power at village and municipal levels, something that I think no other country has done. I'm not sure why this kind of statistic does not influence how India is perceived. But I want to present to you another statistic that further complicates this picture. We are widely perceived to be a country that is terribly violent towards its women. Indeed, India is often called the rape capital of the world. So let's look at rape statistics in the world. I have in front of me figures from the United Nations Office of Drug and Crimes. These are figures that are about 6 years old, but I don't think they've changed drastically. And these figures describe what is called the rate of rape per 100,000 people in different countries in the world. Here are the figures. India is 1.8. The United States is 27.3. The United Kingdom is 28.8. Sweden is 63.5. And South Africa is 120. I'm sure this comes as a surprise to you. It did to me too, but it made me think, what is happening here? I don't think the answer is that as an Indian, I should be congratulating myself and saying, well, things are not so bad in India. After all, we are 1.8 and the US is 27.3. That means they have at least 25 times more rape than we do. No, I don't think that is the answer, because as far as I'm concerned, and I imagine for all of you too, even one rape is one too many. But certainly when you see something like these figures, they force you to think about the wide gap between public perception and the reality. If other countries have a much higher rate of rape than India, why is it that we don't hear this? Or is it that these statistics are wrong? All such information is based on reported cases, and we know well that in many of our countries, including India, many cases do not get reported. But even if you take the Indian figure and multiply it by a factor of 10, which is usually what is believed to be the factor that you need to multiply to get an accurate figure, you are still looking at a figure that is quite low in comparison with others. What does this mean? Sorry, I'm jumping now because I'm losing time. I have to say that I don't have an answer to this. You may or may not agree with this, but I want to suggest something here. One possible way of looking at things that can give us a more nuanced view. In India, we have a very strong and dynamic women's movement. Since the early 70s, when the movement against sexual violence began, women activists have kept alive the discussion, particularly on rape. It is their belief that it is necessary to create public pressure for change to happen. As a result of their efforts, there have been 2 major changes in the law, and the fact of sexual violence has now become speakable. The silence on it is being broken. This is something that is widely acknowledged and acknowledged as an issue that needs to be addressed. In December of 2012, the capital city of Delhi, a young woman, a medical student, was gang raped in a moving bus, and later she died from her injuries. Outraged at this tragic incident, hundreds of thousands of people across the country came out to protest. They included men, women, families, rich, poor, everyone. The government was forced to step in, and one of the things that happened was that the law on rape was changed in very fundamental ways. Since that moment, women's groups have ensured that sexual violence does not disappear from the public eye. They have kept up the pressure on government, on media, on people, and one of the results has been the enormous attention the media pay to this. The newspapers are full of such reports every day. For us in India, we can see that one of the positive results of such media attention is that more and more women are coming out to report cases. That the police, who were earlier indifferent and sometimes even hostile, are now being forced to be much more responsible in filing cases. But one of the negative results of this is that when people read such reports, they begin to believe that sexual crimes are rampant, and this is the only reality of our world, and that is so not true. Why does rape not get reported so widely in the media in other countries? After all, if the rate of rape is so high, say in Sweden and the United States, why do we not see reports about it in the media? And here I would like to suggest another answer. I'm not sure if this is the right thing, but here is my guess. I think that in many other countries, what has happened is that over time, they have developed good law enforcement mechanisms and indeed good laws, so that when and if a sexual crime happens, it gets reported to the police and is dealt with by the law. It does not make news in the same way as murder and robbery get reported, and if such crimes and do not make news. If such crimes remain untalked of, surely that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And here I want to bring in just one other thing before I close. There's so much talk about the recent Me Too campaign that has had its beginnings in the US. What does this campaign tell us? I find it very interesting because to me, one of the things that it reveals is how difficult it is, even today, even in the so-called developed countries, to speak about sexual violence. So many of the women who are now speaking out are well-known, powerful celebrities, but even for them, speaking out was difficult. It tells me that sexual violence is still rampant and is still silenced. And importantly, that it does not only happen in countries like ours, but everywhere. I'd like to draw my talk to an end, and I'd like to end it as I began with a story. Some 10 or 15 years ago, a group of women, poor village women, mostly from the very bottom of the social ladder, got together to start a village newspaper they called Khabar Leheriya. They put whatever money they had together, they got the help of an NGO, and they began. They went out to the village, reported little stories, charming things, funny things, serious things. Over time, their newspaper became a place where people could talk about problems in the village and find solutions to them through public discussion. For this, they were attacked by local men who began to fear them, but they were appreciated by others, and many regional and national level newspapers began to use their services to file stories for which they could not afford to send out a reporter. In this way, the women became stronger. Today, their newspaper has more than doubled in circulation. They have received many awards, and all the villagers around them feel this is their paper. Stories like this, and there are thousands of these in India, are to me as important as the stories of violence, and they are as much a part of understanding India and Indian women as the stories of violence are. Every country, no matter how advanced, I believe, and this is a terrible thing to believe, but I do believe that it is true, finds its own levels of discrimination and violence towards its women. Because as we know now, patriarchy has very deep roots and a great deal of social sanction. The battle to change this is not easy, as much of the time we are battling people we care for, people we love, or those whose ideologies we share. It is something that we all need to realize is a difficult but necessary battle. Taiwan and India, in that sense, have many things in common. Both countries fought off a history of colonialism. You with mainland China and Japan, we with the British. Both created egalitarian constitutions, and yet both implemented laws that were discriminatory to women. Over the years, you have amended and changed those laws, as have we. Your changes in family laws have now given women an equal status in the family. Your domestic violence acts deal with a much silenced issue. Your recognition of marital rape is so important. We too have implemented laws which have given women more rights. In inheritance, in child custody, in divorce, in marriage, we have a domestic violence act, we have a new law on sexual violence, we have a sexual harassment act. But there is still a long way to go. And I think that it is that goal that we need to focus on rather than point fingers or be fearful of other cultures. And in closing, I really just want to say this. The discrimination that exists in the world towards women is a very serious, very long-standing, and very difficult to address problem. It is not a competition in which some countries are ahead of others and can point fingers and say, look, we've done this and you haven't, therefore you are terrible and we are much better. But unfortunately, that is how it gets seen. Much more important is to see how each country, with its history, its own particular context, has taken this issue and tried to deal with it. And much more important is to see not only the statistics, but what lies behind the statistics, which are the human stories, and what lies behind the attempts to change the realities that women experience. And if you do that, you will find a much more nuanced, a much more complete, and a much more real story that is one of the truths, not the only truth, of women in any country, including India. And this poster that you see on the wall is something that many of us, on the screen, feminists in India, see as something that gives us another human right, which has been denied to us and to many women in the world, that is the right to leisure. So sit down, put your feet up, put on the television if you like, read a book if you like, drink a cup of tea, drink a glass of wine, and just chill after all the hard work that we've done. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Urvashi, for the inspiring talk. And we're going to open the floor later to the audience, to questions and comments and views. But before that, I would like to take advantage of being a host to pose some questions to you. And you have to review the stories of women's struggles and women's movements in India in your talk. But I would like to ask about how the popular culture have reflected in India on the women's representation since I'm a music producer, so I concentrate a lot on music videos of India. So while browsing the videos of the best Punjabi songs of recent years, it is hard not to notice that women in quite a number of videos are portrayed as vulnerable victims, who are threatened by violence and protected by men. What are your views on this, the representation of women in Indian pop culture? Yeah, it's on.
Okay. So I have a question and answer to your question. And that is, tell me one music video in the world by anyone, woman, man, anyone, that depicts women as free, empowered beings. Can you think of one?
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm just saying that, okay, let me put it differently. I think music videos by their very nature, if you can use that word, you can't really use that word, but are not egalitarian things at all, and they are often extremely violent, often quite regressive. So for us to look for empowered women in music videos, I don't think is that realistic, whether it's India or elsewhere. But more than that, I would say that, I'm not denying what you're saying, but I would say that popular culture in a country like India actually is much, much wider than Bollywood and music videos. There is a whole lot of folk traditions. There are a whole lot of local singing traditions. There's local theater. All of that is actually popular culture at the ground level. And in those, you might see stories of women being seen as victims, and I think that is a reality. But you will also see other kinds of stories. So I think you have to take the two realities together.
So would you please give us some examples, like where we can see music videos or different references?
Okay, so you can go, if there is a singer called Teejan Bai, T-E-E-J, Teejan Bai. She comes from a place in central India called Jharkhand. And if you Google her, you will find lots of very interesting things about her. There is a singer called Parvati Baul. If you Google her, and they are quite well known in the sense they're very popular and all of that. And I can give you lots of other names that you could look up, and you might find a different reality. So my argument really is that you have to look at all of that.
But I was also concerning how influential are these most popular or best Punjabi songs could bring to the audience. So
yeah, I mean, that is a question, I think, to which there isn't an easy answer, because really nowhere in the world have we as yet found an answer to the question of whether there is a direct connect between, let's say, popular cinema and the violence that it portrays and the violence you see in real life, or popular cinema and its discrimination towards women and what you see in real life. So I can't answer that with any on the basis of any research or anything, but what I can say is that Bollywood and songs are extremely popular, extremely wide-ranging, and even though you may not have academics who are able to prove that with numbers, but you can see the impact on people. And the impact is not good. It's not really good. For example, so much of the sexual chase in Bollywood cinema is about the man chasing the woman, and the woman saying no, and the man not taking no for an answer, but insisting that her no means yes. And it is, and I mean, in a sense, it's a strange thing, but in Indian culture, that's very much there as well. So if I go to somebody's house on a visit and they offer me tea or something to eat, the polite thing to do is to say no. You don't directly say yes. So you say no, no, and then there's this dance that everybody plays, and then finally they'll insist and you have it. You have it because really you really want it and you don't know how to say yes. So it plays over into this, but it has terrible consequences because the whole notion of consent does not then enter the minds of many of our men. And that is also why rape occurs, because men don't take no for an answer. So I'm not denying that. I think, yes, it's very much there and it's a very serious issue.
Are there any women's organizations trying to use the popular culture to actually to advocate or to advocate the different issues or different sides?
Yes, many women's organizations. I mean, many that are also working with actors, women actors in Bollywood cinema, many who are also trying to get women actors to fight for their rights in an industry which does not pay them as much as it pays the men. But it's a very difficult fight because many of those women actors, because they earn money from it, would be playing roles which are extremely regressive. And then you can't be fighting, when you're doing that, it becomes very difficult to fight for your rights. So it's a complicated kind of issue, but there are many organizations that do work with popular artists and with writers and with craftspeople and all of that.
And recently I also noticed different stories from filmmakers. Yeah. For example, like PK, the film PK, starred by Amir Khan, and directed by Rakuma Hirani. And he actually poses the criticism of the religious separatism that falsely constructs the hostility by the partition. So I could also see music video shows the tragic story of the division of Pakistan and India. Yeah, so I could see that there are also changes of the scene. What is your observation on that?
On whether the partition is reflected in popular media? Yes, so a long time back, I think it must have been the late 70s, I'm not exactly sure, we had two very popular television programs on the partition. And on the days when those programs would come, people would disappear off the streets because everybody would be watching television. And they were very emotional programs because they were about a history, especially in North India, about a history that we had ignored and not really talked about at a people-to-people level. But those programs were not allowed to continue on television by people with vested interests who went to court and said, we can't show this kind of volatile material because it will create enmities between people. And so those were taken off television. But today you have a lot more and a lot of Pakistani programs that when India and Pakistan are being friends, which is rare, but it happens sometimes, then those programs come and are very popular. And a lot of them are to do with the division of the country. So it's a history that is now opening up much more, 70 years later.
Thank you very much. And so we are going to open the floor to the audience, to the questions and comments and views. And I would like to remind our audience to make your question and views and your points brief, since we have limited times. Okay, so. Okay, we have the first audience who raises their hand, the girl in red. Okay.
Hi. I would like to know how you started to become a feminist activist. How did you start to raise your voice when you were still young and unrecognized, and how did you gradually become a voice that is influential? Thank you.
How did I decide to raise my voice? Oh, okay. Thank you for that question. I was not alone when I became an activist. It was when I was at university, and the women's movement was kind of growing around us, and all of us were asking questions about the inequalities that we saw around us. So there were a lot of women, and there were a lot of political discussions, but we were not fully confident of what we could do, what we could demand, who to protest in front of, etc. We started with small things. So at college, for example, we started with demanding that girls' hostels and boys' hostels have the same timing, because what used to happen was that in the boys' hostels, the boys could go out and they could come back whenever they liked, but the girls' hostels, the girls were told you have to be back by 8 o'clock. So one of our first battles was to say, why this discrimination? And you must make it the same. So if you're going to put a restriction on the boys also, otherwise don't put a restriction on anyone. Similarly, we fought for buses so that we could travel, because in Delhi, I was in college in Delhi, the bus system in Delhi was then really terrible. So you could not go on a bus without being squeezed in the middle of about 300 people in a bus that could only accommodate 50. And so obviously women had a very hard time. So we demanded that they create separate buses for women and those kind of things. That was how we came into our activism in the early days. We also fought a lot against our teachers, but that was also for other reasons. And then, of course, it grew from there.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Ah, okay. Okay, I got reminded from the organizer that please introduce yourself before you post a question and views. Yeah. Sorry, because of the light, I cannot see. Oh, okay, please.
Thank you, Vachi. My name is Chun Li. I'm coming from University of Nottingham, but I'm a Taiwanese. It's brilliant talk, and you are a tiny lady, but you are very powerful. My first question you already answered by the first questioner. My second question actually may be a little bit abstract, but I wanted to consult you in your perspective. To what extent the women's movement could say you've achieved something? In our country, we have a female president. Will that be meaning something that is women's movement to some extent? I know I'm super simplistic, but I just would like to get more out from you. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I would not put the question in quite that way, because I don't think that we can answer it like that. So, for example, we had a woman prime minister. Later, we had a woman president. We have had 4 of the most important states in India have been ruled by women. So at one time, the chief ministers of those 4 states, all women, held the entire future of India in their hands. But none of those women, starting from our prime minister to our president to those 4 chief ministers, had anything interesting, progressive, or caring to say about women. None of them could be called feminist even in the remotest possible way. So does that mean that they were useless, or are we expecting too much from them? And it's not our struggle that placed them there. It was actually with Indira Gandhi, it was her family, and so with 2 of the other chief ministers, it was the men they were involved with, from whom they inherited power, and so on. So I don't think that we can claim the women's movement can claim any credit for that. But I think that as activists in the women's movement, what we have to be very aware of is what the presence of these women means in terms of let's say, the boundaries of possibility. I think it's really important. It's really important to have these women up there, because they are icons, they are aspirational icons, no matter that they behave disgustingly, but they are, I'm talking about our politicians, not about yours. But they make such a difference by showing people that this is possible. And I think that is the case with the contradiction in both our countries, because you would see also many women in Taiwan who are big in business, who are big in politics, and so on and so forth. How did they get there? Some of them may have got there by working really hard from the shop floor. Some may have got there because their family owned businesses which they've inherited. And some are using their power to work well for women and others are not. But just the fact of their presence there makes other women believe that it's possible we can also get there. And as a feminist, I would say that is really valuable.
Thank you. So we get, okay. Just wait for a microphone, please.
Thanks for the speech, and I'm a high school student from Taipei, and I have seen some statement that Indian men consider Indian women as their belonging, not as an individual person. So is that true that Indian men take patriarchy as granted, and how can the Indian government to improve such environment, such as educating and improve the lack of infrastructure? Yes, sorry.
Thank you for the question.
Actually, thank you. You have given some of the answer to your question yourself, but let me just put it out there for you. So it is true that many Indian men, not all, are deeply patriarchal, and many consider women their property and treat them very badly. But that is changing quite a lot now, in a small way, but it is changing. And it's not changing because the men have suddenly become transformed into non-patriarchal people, but it is changing because the women refuse to stand for it anymore. And the men are intelligent, so they can see that if the woman is changing, they too have to change. But it's not huge, it's not widespread, but it's changing. And the Indian government, I think governments cannot easily address the problem of patriarchy. What they can do is what they should do, and that's what you pointed to, is to fulfill their responsibilities in terms of education, in terms of providing infrastructure, in terms of ensuring that people have rights, in terms of ensuring that people have jobs, all of that. The Indian government has done some of this, but not enough. And if they do that, suppose that they fulfill all their responsibilities in terms of education, etc., you already have the conditions which will make it possible for people to start changing inside their heads. Because people will be more educated, they will know more, they will ask more questions, and so on. They will be more aware of their rights. So the government cannot change what's in here. People can, but the government can change what's outside, infrastructure and other things, which can help people to change. And yes, our government has not done enough of that.
Thank you very much. Okay, there are so many hands waiting, so it's difficult to decide. Maybe, yes, okay, please.
Hi, my name is Sahar, and I'd like to thank you for a very thought-provoking talk today. I would like to know what your thoughts are on what impact does an upbringing at home actually have on how women are perceived in Indian society. Because, you know, a lot of the time we spend with our mothers, grandmothers at home, and children role model. And what sort of an impact does that actually have on the perception of women in society?
Sahar, I think a lot, especially in a country like ours where the family is a very, very strong unit. You know, we've still not moved away from the family. And so I think that there's a very deep impact, but I don't think it's an impact on the way people are perceived in society. I think the impact is on how you perceive yourself. So if your parents have drilled it into your head that you're a woman and your fate in life is to get married and you mustn't do anything else, then it's very difficult to see yourself as something other than this knowledge that you have grown up with. In fact, in terms of perception, people may see you as something completely different because you're out in the public world and there are lots and lots of different people in the public world. I see this a lot with my students. I teach a course in a liberal arts university in Delhi, and that course is on feminism. And my students come from fairly upper middle class families who are quite traditional. And they are thrown into this liberal arts residential university where young men and young women are living in the same space. Their hormones are raging. Sexuality is rampant. It's in the air. It's around them. And all of them, this is the first time they become sexually active. And, you know, they're dealing with the baggage of what their parents have taught them, but what peer pressure is perceiving them to be, and how to deal with those two things. And it's so interesting to see the churning that's happening inside their minds and how that's leading to change. So I think upbringing has a lot to do with it. But I don't think it's in how you're perceived, but in how you see yourself.
And the lady who's sitting next to, did you also raise your hand, please?
Okay. My name is Virginia. I'm from the United States. And I don't know if this question is too personal for you, but as you were growing up, did you experience inequality in your home, in your family home?
You're asking me that question?
Yes, I am, yes.
Yes and no. My mother was a very strong feminist. And she brought up 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, in a fairly traditional household where my grandmother lived with us. So my grandmother was deeply unequal towards us. She would, at the dining table, feed my father first because he was her son, then my 2 brothers, then us, then herself, then my sister, then my mother. So we were deeply aware of the inequality. But my mother subverted it all by teaching us all kinds of tactics to trick my grandmother into giving us more food. So, and that was extremely liberating. And she also taught our brothers to do all the household work, to be feminist. She herself hated the kitchen. And she made us all believe that hating the kitchen for a woman was completely legitimate. So it was really interesting. And my grandmother, you know, she used to go to sleep in the afternoons. And at that time, traditional Punjabi women, they wore what I'm wearing along with a thing called a salwar, which is like these loose trousers. And it used to have a string to hold it together. So the salwar's waistband was that big. And the string would gather it up so it looked elegant. And it was a very long string. She would go to sleep with the keys of a tin trunk in which she kept lots of food tied to her band. And my mother taught us how to quietly go undo it while she was sleeping, steal the food, fill our stomachs so that if she didn't feed us at the table, that was fine. And we did that really well. She knew, my grandmother got to know, but we did it. So yes, I grew up in a very egalitarian and yet non-egalitarian household.
Okay. Okay. So maybe we can ask the male feminist over there, if you are.
Hello. Thank you for your insightful talk. Yeah, I'm Zikri from Malaysia, but I'm now based in Chiao Tung University. So you have given in the industry. It would be great if you can actually expand on how economic fundamentalism actually happening in India as well. As you can see on how the BJP-led party right now under Narendra Modi, how he actually expanded on special economic zone, and there's a lot of accumulation by dispossession, especially with the dam project in India, where there's a lot of Dalit people, Adivasi was being displaced from their own context. So it would be great if you can actually expand your talk, and also if there is any feminist critique towards the economic fundamentalism that happens in India right now. Thank you.
Okay, you're asked me to do a whole other area. I deliberately stayed away from talking about Dalit experiences because I wasn't sure how much people would know and how much I would need to explain of that. And it's a fairly complicated explanation. But certainly there is a very strong feminist critique of the globalization model that India has followed since the 70s, since the 90s. Which has opened up the Indian economy to the entry of foreign capital, and which has brought into India a kind of, sweatshop labor, but not as you see it in many other, not as you see it in countries like the Philippines or Malaysia or elsewhere, that is not so much in factories as it is in people's homes, so where they are manufacturing smaller things. And this has added to women's work burden in very serious ways. And it's a very difficult issue to tackle, because what happens is that women are already putting, rural women, village women are already putting in long hours of work. Poor women are already putting in long hours of work in the home and in the field, etc. And now you bring in a sort of income generating activity into the home, which adds 2 more hours to your work, and which also adds an income. So nobody sees your oppression because they can only see the money. So there's been a big battle about this. It's also complicated by the fact that in urban areas, particularly Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad, the entry of global capital, and particularly of the information technology industry, has created a lot of jobs for urban women. And these are extremely visible jobs. These are jobs that have taken women out of their homes and allowed them to earn a pretty decent income. So you might be critiquing globalization, but on the other side, you do have this aspect that you have to also look at. So there is a critique, there are lots of discussions about it, and feminists have not taken, many feminists are anti-capitalist. They may not be totally leftist, they may be centrist, whatever, but they have a critique of capital. So that has been happening in India. As far as the dam is concerned, as you know, the movement against the dam, its entire leadership is female, and they're fighting on behalf of poor, underprivileged, tribal, low-caste people. So the connections between the struggles of the poor and the underprivileged and the women's movement are very strong connections. There's a lot of points on which they ally.
Okay, please, can we?
Thank you. I'm an Israeli living here in Taipei. When I finished my army in Israel, we all go and travel in India, and that was a long time ago. And I remember it was not very pleasant and easy to travel as a woman alone. I have students now, women students in Taiwan, who ask me about either traveling in India or studying in India, and they have the notion that it's very unsafe. What can you say about that? What can I tell them about that?
Tell them that they won't know till they try it. See, I think, it can be very unpleasant traveling alone in India as a woman, especially as a foreign woman. Why? Because I'm not making any excuses for it. I'm just trying to give you some context. Because of our colonial history, there is a way in which Indians and Indian men, but also Indian women, believe that the foreign woman is sexually available. Okay? So that is one thing. Secondly, there is no concept of privacy in India. We don't believe in that thing. It's not, it drives me around the bend, but people don't believe in it. So you could be traveling on a train in India, and the people sitting around you will ask you, so where are you going? Are you married? How long have you been married? How many children do you have? You don't have children? Why? You've been married 3 years, you haven't had children? Don't you have sex with your husband? It just is like they feel they have a right to your, they're being friendly, but they feel they have a right to your life. Now, your concepts of privacy and our concepts of privacy completely apart. You will see this as very intrusive. Then it's your, I mean, if you're white, you're fair skin. If you're black, it's worse. Because we are, I'm ashamed to say it, but we are quite racist towards black Africans. We see ourselves, we have a sense of color. The Indians are obsessed with color. So everyone wants to be fair. And they see, therefore, black people as inferior to them, because in comparison with black Africans, Indian skins are brown, so there's a degree of fairness over there. So that is a terrible thing, but they see foreigners as falling into that class, and foreign women as, therefore, people they can easily target. This is not made easier by foreign women who don't know this culture and who behave freely. I'm not saying you shouldn't. But, for example, class is a big thing in India, right? So if I am going somewhere, I will not endorse it, but I have to learn to live by its rules and not cross those boundaries sometimes, because it complicates things. So if I'm going somewhere in a car and a driver is driving me and I stop on the way to eat something, I will not sit at the same table as the driver. I will eat and he will eat separately. And that's the protocol. Now, I remember traveling in India with a French friend of mine once, and she brought a bottle of whiskey for our driver, and she invited him to the bar at night. And the fellow was just so overwhelmed that he spent the whole night knocking on her door, because he thought it was an invitation. I kept telling her, Françoise, don't do this. You don't do it in India. So I think all societies have little cultural rules. If you can learn them and be a little careful, I think you're fine. But you have to always be aware of the dangers which might lie there. I mean, when I first traveled, you won't believe this, I used to go to the Frankfurt Book Fair. And when I first went to Frankfurt, I used to be so frightened of going home at night. I had to go to a far-off place. And the reason I was frightened was not because I thought German men were whatever, you know. I was frightened because I looked Indian. And I looked different. I was always dressed like an Indian. And I stood out like a sore thumb. And you don't want to attract attention to yourself. So I think there are some rules of travel that you have to face. And if you really look at the number of cases of women travelers being attacked in India, there will not be that many. So I don't think it's going to kill you or you will end up being assaulted, I think.
Okay, so we have only like 5 minutes left, so we're going to have our last question. Maybe from this side of the audience, maybe we need some
voices. Can we do one thing? Can we take the 2 or 3 questions and I'll just respond together? That maybe, and I'll try not to be a long response so that you can at least ask your question.
Okay. Okay, please, we can have, yes.
So hello, and I'm just a college student from Taipei actually. My question is that, so with many movements of feminists along the world, like no matter in Korea, USA, or in Taiwan, there are many objections, like negative comments. We can see it in social networks, like social media, on these feminist achievements. So my question is that, in your life, have you met any objections or negative comments as a feminist, and how you deal with it? So I hope this answer can give a hint to all those feminists or who stands for feminism in Taiwan or in anywhere. So thank you very much.
Many, but I live with them. It's okay.
Okay, so that's the answer. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah.
Okay. Let's take both of those.
Okay. So maybe the last. I think we take the last question. Yeah.
I'm a Taipei native, and I'm a student at National Taiwan University. So what are your thoughts on education, especially gender education in schools? Will it help men and boys realize their privileges, even though an entirely different set of values, one that favors them, are being taught at home?
On education? Yeah, okay. Okay. Did you want to ask your question also?
Okay, so maybe we take the last, sorry,
my question is kind of similar. I'm a high school teacher, and I was wondering, because for the Me Too movement in America, I feel like I've seen a lot of men saying that these women are being too sensitive, and they were taking advantage of the situation by coming forward, because those were mostly allegations, not actually like things with proof. So I was wondering what you would how you would teach young girls when they're still teenagers, for example, to distinguish like what's the boundary of like sexual harassment and assault, and when it happens, how to deal with it. Because I feel like it's included in the sex ed, but still a lot of women, especially as Asian women, I feel like we've been taught to be obedient, polite, non-confrontational. So I'm just wondering how you would teach young girls to deal with situations like that. Thank you.
Okay, I think in response to your question, I think education is really important, and education needs to have a really central core or central element that sensitizes people to gender, diversity, inclusion, all of those things which are so much a part of our society. But unfortunately, we don't really have that, and governments, certainly our government does not spend enough on education. Whenever they have focused on educational programs for women, they have found women responding hugely and enthusiastically and coming out and learning, and you can see the difference it makes to their lives. Okay. On the Me Too campaign and young people, the question that you've asked, I think, the thing is that it is, for women of my generation, for example, we lived with sexual harassment. We never even thought of speaking out about it. Many times we didn't even recognize it as sexual harassment. Many of the women who've spoken out now are looking back on their lives and are able to recognize the anger that they have kept inside them and are speaking out about it. We have a very interesting version of Me Too in India, which is a young lawyer put on Facebook a list of people, and then others added to it. And it was a list of university professors, really well known, really well respected, who each of these young people was saying had sexually harassed one or other of them at university. But the list had no proof, nothing, just names. So it started a big discussion on this whole thing of saying, can you just put up names without proof, or should you not actually substantiate what you're saying? Because otherwise, how will those people be able to respond, and how can those cases be taken up officially unless you say this happened here and there? Big discussion. And then recently a second list has come up, which is a list also of young people. But it's now no longer their professors, it is their peers, the men that they work with, study with, etc. And it's got all the proof that you need. Email messages, SMSs, etc., etc. And there is a big discussion about that. What it shows to me really is how widespread sexual harassment is, how young people now understand it much better than we did because there's so much discussion, and how it is necessary to deal with it. So universities are, for example, now doing all sorts of things. The university where I teach has just asked me and 2 other people if for the full year we will do 50 sexual harassment workshops with them for all their staff at every level, which means every 10 days you do a sensitization type of workshop. They want to try this as an experiment to see whether something like this can be made part of the agenda of education. And because educational institutions have a long life, they are well placed to implement that, and then to see whether it has any result. So we'll see after a year or 2 of doing this whether it actually makes a difference.
Thank you very much. So I'm really sad to announce that we have to conclude the discussion session. I realize that there are still questions in queue, but we really have to call an end. So before that, Urvashi, would you like to make further remarks to your talk today to conclude the discussion?
Which answer? How do, oh.
She already answered that.
Yeah, no, I think that, okay, everybody, I think that if you were not challenged by a critique of what you're doing, by people who are opposed to what you're doing, by people who don't like what you're doing, then you become complacent about it. So I think it's important to accept those challenges. What I have learned over the years is not to be infuriated by them. So when I was young, I would get into a rage and a fury and fight and everything. I no longer do that. I try very hard to understand where that question is coming from, even if it's very critical of my point of view or what I believe, and respond to it with some calm. But you can do that when you're 66 years old. You can't do it when you're 20. And I just want to say thank you all for listening, for your patience and the curiosity that brought you here. It's really nice to be able to talk to you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank Urvashi for the insightful and inspiring talk and discussion. Thank you so much.